In this video, I wanted to talk about oral tradition. What does it mean to come from an oral tradition, and what are the implications or the impacts on your craft or on how you perceive different things? So, first of all, coming from an oral tradition has nothing to do with, resenting books or not being educated or anything like that. Because I've seen some of the discussions and I think people are kind of going way, way off. It's not because you're not writing things down or you are not documenting them or using, a book of shadows or a grimoire or anything like that, that you are uneducated or that you're not going to remember your spells. So I want to get to get that out of the way, first of all, because it's such, an ignorant assumption to make. A lot of people do not need to write anything down to remember it. It's just like, your favorite recipe. You already know. Some people, they're not going to be able to tell you take 2 or 3 spoons, but they be able to get to the perfect taste by, doing it intuitively. They will know, what more of which ingredient they need to add in order to get that perfect taste. And it's kind of the same way for certain individual. They can cast spells without having to have a spell book, without having to write the spell down before, without having to search for inspiration on other words and all the stuff. Sometimes it just comes spontaneously to them and they don't feel the need to write that down anywhere because they simply trust their craft that the next time they need to cast a spell or do a ritual or anything like that, all of the information they need will come to them at that moment. And so I come from an oral tradition, which means that usually we don't write anything down. Like I've learned from observing my grandmother, asking questions, experimenting myself. Okay, so I didn't read any of my the knowledge I got from my tradition. I didn't read them in the books. The books that I've mentioned in some of my previous videos are books that I read recently in the past 5 or 4 years. So it has nothing to do with my upbringing or my own tradition. And besides, those are books that are from, individuals from different countries to provide a different perspective from people who have written about it. And even if you see that book from of Water and the Spirit, the person even clearly states that before writing the book, he had to get permission to make sure that the knowledge put in there was knowledge that was okay to disseminate with the masses, to the masses. And for me, it's kind of the same way. I cannot just barge all of the knowledge that I have onto YouTube and share that with everybody. So, and you've seen this with other YouTubers as well who are in the craft. There are certain things that you have to maintain private. There are certain things that remain potent in the dark within yourself that you have to keep. And there are other things that you can tweak and share so that people get inspired, people learn from you. And that's what I've been doing in my videos. But essentially, I come from an old tradition, so my grandmother didn't have a book of shadow. She didn't pass on a book of shadow to my daughter. She didn't receive a book of shadow or anything like that. And so I really came across all of the idea of having a book of shadow, a grimoire, all of that when I started studying Western witchcraft, and later on when I looked into Wicca. And it is fascinating as an idea because you are able to write things down and you are able to have something that's tangible and dense and physical to, even push your energy as you're crafting and doing all those different things, decorating and writing. And sometimes some people will even write that with their personals. They will include all kind of different things in there to make the book itself a magical object, which is fantastic and fabulous. But at the same time, to me, it's really a crystallization of something. And as I started having children, I started thinking, do I want to start having a grimoire and, a book of shadows and all these different things to be able to pass that down to them. But eventually, intuitively and instinctively, even in my interaction with my child, it has been basically something that I prefer to teach them by experience. I prefer them to see and know what it means, to know how to do it, rather than to read it in the book, even if it is in my book. And also because oftentimes a lot of people will be stuck on the book. They will think, they will take the book for face value, having a book of spells and writing the exact same spell or tweaking it just a little bit, but they're not necessarily gonna have more inspiration to start making up their own spell, to get out of the books and experiment and do other things. And to me, that's kind of what sometimes books tend to do, because it's written in a book, it has to be true, it has to become some form of dogma that you have to live by, or because a certain number of people are agreeing with the book, a certain number of people or a certain community is agreeing with the book, you may sometimes feel obligated to also, jump on the bandwagon and kind of like acknowledge the sanctity of what is being said in that particular book. So there are some positive and negative aspects to writing things down. Now, what I do value is the fact that when you have something important to write, then it needs to be crystallized, especially if you know this is something that the generation coming after you are going to forget, or maybe manipulated to forget, or maybe induced to forget. In this case, this is why you will use the crystallization form by writing it down, and writing in stone most oftentimes, or writing it down in some form of way or fashion. And in our tradition, we've seen that all over the place. We've seen that in Egypt. We've seen that with the manuscript in Timbuktu. We've seen it with the statues from the Olmecs, and with the Mayas. We've seen it all over the planet. There was some type of information that had been crystallized so that we will be able to remember it, so that we will be able to have access to it again. Because obviously, it was known even before our time that we will come to forget it for some reason. So in that sense, writing down and crystallizing that information is really important, so that the posterity, so that the future generation may have access to it. But I think the oral tradition is just as important, because part of the reason why you need to crystallize it is because there's something going on where the passing of the tradition cannot be done in a specific way, and this is why you need to crystallize it, so that anyone may be able to have access to that, or at least some people. But if you are able to perpetrate the oral initiations, then the need for crystallization becomes less important, and you are able to give the knowledge and give the experimentation to someone else in an oral form. And of course, the most important benefit of passing the information orally is that it can never be taken away from that person, so that it can never fall into the quote-unquote wrong hands. And I underline this so very much, because it's so important to always stress that whatever information, whatever craft you part on is foremost because of your mind, because of your soul, because of you and who you are and how you deal with it. That's what makes it magical. That's what makes it work. It's you are the power that jumpstart the spell, that fire shoot the hex or the enchantment or the workings you're doing. It's because of you. So don't rely so much on books. They're really nice and crafty to have these different projects, and I see most of the time all of the newbies, one of the number one thing that they want to do is to have a book of shadow. Everybody has to have a book of shadow. And I understand the need for it. I do. Maybe it's because I am from an oral tradition, and I value much more what is being said orally, carried in the winds, and you can get it back so many ways, so many times. What information you actually gain from having your own experimentation and infusing yourselves with the reaction you have while you're doing and experimenting, so that you can actually transmit it to your children through the blood. Another thing that I do find interesting about having a written tradition or having materials that are being written, it's the availability to explore from other tradition, from other cultures, to be able to read and actually process that information within you, to actually sit with that, meditate, have that kind of a meaty experience where you are completely immersing yourself in the knowledge that you've just read, and working with it, exploring it, even having dream works with specific sacred texts, putting that sacred text under your pillow and exploring what kind of experimentation or experience you have in the dream work, or even going to that place in your dreams. Those are very, I think, those are some of my most treasured experiment, when you're actually diving in that culture, diving in the energy of the culture, the principles of the culture. It's really, really beautiful. And also what it does when you do that, it opens your mind. It opens your mind to accept different views, to accept different perception, to accept different way of living. And it enriches you because of that. It makes you more inclined to recognize injustices when they come, to recognize also prejudice when you hear and you're around it. It really gives you some form of a greater understanding of what humanity is. So this is why even though I am from an old tradition, I'm not bashing, writing things down, and I'm not bashing books. Of course, books are useful. I have tons and tons of books all around me that I use to be able to, get access to certain information, that I use to sometimes just escape and dive into the world within the book. They served various purposes, and I think it's a wonderful tool, especially for children, when they start reading and they're able to dive into different stories, into mythology, into different type of religions, different type of cultures. It's just one of the most amazing tangible tools that they can have. At the same time, your mind, your meditation, imagination can be just as powerful, and can be even more expensive than diving into a book. But we do need different perspective, and this is what enriches our craft and enriches the number of tools that we have. You can take one subject and have so many different books written on it, so many different perspectives written on that, so that you can explore, you can actually see what resonates with you, you can see what works for you, and you can basically take what works and leave what doesn't. So it's basically really, books are a great addition to the craft, and they enable us to crystallize certain information and to be able to analyze information from our logical brain, or from our more intuitive place, if we want to see how energetically we resonate with the information and experiment with it. They play different roles. Now, when it comes to sacred text and your sacred tools and your sacred book of shadows and so forth and so on, your sacred instrument, your sacred recording tools, they are deemed sacred because you infuse them to be so, because you decided they are so. When I usually look at different cultures and the texts that they're using, I approach them as sacred texts because I know it is sacred to someone else. It doesn't mean I'm going to go by them, or I'm going to necessarily adopt what's in there. It's just saying that I approach it with some type of respect. And I underline this because sometimes in our discussion I don't shy away from controversial topics, but sometimes we talk about how certain texts or certain messages have been distorted throughout the years, or sometimes when they fall into the hands of certain cultures, they end up being moved and changed. So sometimes this is why it's also oftentimes very important to preserve the original context, where the culture, and contextualize to the culture where the text is coming from. And I think this is one of the issue I've seen sometimes, where information is being taken out of the context, or sometimes we try to take the culture it comes from out of the actual information, or away from the same information, or to distancing from the information, and this distinct the information from the source, which to me is not acceptable. To me, it's really, you have to approach everything with the respect that it is due to, and like I said, I'm not a Christian per se anymore, but I do read the Bible. I do approach it as a sacred text, even though I don't read it as I was taught in Sunday's Bible study. I have my own way of learning from the text, and the many other sacred texts that I use in my practice, or that I use just to enrich myself in terms of learning about other cultures and learning about other people and how they perceive the environment, how they perceive the world. I think it is sometimes presumptions for people to assume that because you are not financially wealthy or not literate, that you do not have the knowledge. There are many people, and I say, like I mentioned, even in my own tradition, there's no such thing as Book of Shadows. I know many traditions where, and generally in Africa, there is no Book of Shadows. People are not writing down their spells, they're not writing down their workings, they're not writing down certain recipes. Is that as you experiment, as you become a herbalist, as you discover herbs and you start knowing what they're good for, it's just start to be ingrained in your brain. It's just start being intuitive knowledge that comes to you when you need it, even in case of emergency. And this is kind of how you teach your children. You will teach them, what this herb is, what it does, and as you repeat that and they experiment for themselves, they start internalizing that as well. Therefore, you wouldn't have, the need to have some piece of paper with the information written down on it. And I'm saying this just because sometimes I do see people looking down on other people just because they are not necessarily don't know how to read and write. It doesn't mean you're not going to be able to do magic. And it's not because you don't know how to read and write, even in this day and age, that you're poor or that you don't have resources available to you. Or that your life is not completely fulfilled. So just drop the misconception and allow yourself to really follow the magic. The magic will show you that basically the magic will destroy every single assumption you can have, every single prejudice you can have, because you never know where the next magical thing is going to happen and who's going to be doing it. So you may as well humble yourself and just be open-minded to keep learning. And by keeping learning, it's going to be a working process, because you're going to have to check yourself to make sure you don't have these prejudices working when you are assessing somebody, or when you're trying something new or learning about something new. And I'm saying this because the craft is not immune to mundane activities, as some will like to pretend. It is not immune to having biases and racism going on. It is not immune to having sexism and all kind of other programming from the matrix. However, it is, a space where many are working to get rid of this programming, and many are working to heal themselves and to grow spiritually, emotionally, in all of these different aspects. But from my perspective, it is still a work in progress, and I hope everyone is still mindful of that and don't necessarily try to look away from this kind of problem, and rather make sure they work on themselves. They include that in the improvement that they're trying to make in their own journey. So just to ensure that as we all work on ourselves, we are indeed making this place a better one for everyone. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.